Well, I believe that we as evangelicals have a lot to learn from the Church Fathers about biblical interpretation. I just want to highlight two things quickly that I would point to as important. First of all, the Fathers understand the practice of biblical interpretation to be a spiritual discipline that leads to sanctification. This is very important because today in hermeneutics, we often talk about the greatest obstacle to understanding the meaning of the text being the distance between the culture of the writer of the text and our culture today. And that is true. There's a distance there, and there's a gulf to be overcome. But there's a bigger problem with interpreting the Bible. And throughout history, the history of the great interpreters of the church have understood that we are the obstacle to good interpretation. It's human pride, it's human laziness, it's human narcissism, it's human disobedience. We as interpreters need to be changed in order to understand what God is saying to us through the text. And so biblical interpretation is a spiritual discipline. And the Fathers are big on this. They really stress the fact that we have to be docile before the text. We have to be submissive to the text. We have to treat the text as the voice of God to us and be obedient to what we know before we get more insight and more development. And they don't just see it as an all or nothing. Either you understand the text or you don't. They see mystery in the text. They see depth in the text. And so they see the possibility of our understanding of the text growing and deepening as we become more capable of seeing what's there. The problem is not that what's there isn't there. It's not that it episodically appears and disappears. The problem is that our ability to apprehend what is in the text is inhibited by our sinfulness. And the process of biblical interpretation is a process of becoming sanctified, of becoming obedient, of becoming more and more united with Christ as we read His Word and understand more and more. This is something that we really need to learn from the Fathers. That there's a second thing that the Fathers do, I think that's very important, and that is that they help us to read the Old Testament Christologically. The Fathers help us to see that the Old Testament is Christological in a very deep sense. Deeper than the sense that Christ inspired the Bible, the Old Testament, which is true, and deeper than the sense in which the Old Testament predicts the coming of Christ, which is also true. But in a deeper sense, they see Christ as sacramentally present in the text. They see Christ speaking through the text. For example, Augustine, with his idea of the totus Christus, this is a concept of that he derived from the Apostle Paul, the idea of Christ, of the church as the body of Christ, Christ is the head, His church is the body. And so when Paul encounters Christ on the road to Damascus, Christ says, "Why are you persecuting me?" when Paul has been persecuting the Christians, in fact. And so Augustine says this understanding of the head and the body can be applied to the exegesis of the Psalms, for example. So sometimes when we read the Psalms, we're reading, yes, what David said. On one level, that Psalm 3, for example, is about David and the rebellion of Absalom against David. But on another level, we're reading oftentimes what the head of the body is saying, what Christ is saying, as in Psalm 22, for example. Other times, we are reading what the body of Christ is saying. And some of the laments are about the persecution that the body of Christ is experiencing. And so what Augustine does is he uses this Pauline understanding of Christ to understand the text in such a way that we see Christ actually in the text, speaking through the text. Augustine points to the fact that Christ quotes Psalm 31 on the cross, and he says he did this to instruct us that it is He who is speaking in this psalm. That's Augustine's interpretation of what Christ is trying to say to us by quoting this psalm on the cross. He's trying to say, this is me speaking through my prophet in the Old Testament. And this just opens up the Psalms to be greater and more wondrous and deeper and more enlightening and more edifying and more exciting than I had ever understood the Psalms to be before I read the Augustine and the Psalms. So I think the Church Fathers can help us to understand the wonder and the majesty of the Christological content of the Old Testament. And in the process, we can become sanctified. And so actually reading the Bible, reading the Old Testament becomes a process by which we become more and more deeply united with Christ.